Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply disturbing stories from the woods, those vast, isolated places where civilization ends and something else begins. Places where the trees grow so thick that light barely reaches the forest floor, where sounds carry strangely through the branches, where you can walk for hours without seeing another human being. These aren't stories about getting lost or dealing with wildlife. These are real experiences from real people who discovered that the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't always an animal. Sometimes it's another person. Sometimes it's something you can't quite explain. And sometimes, the woods themselves seem to change the rules of reality. Before we dive in, I want to know, have you ever been alone in the woods and felt like you were being watched? Have you heard footsteps behind you on an empty trail, or seen something moving between the trees that you couldn't explain? Drop a comment and share your experience. Because what you're about to hear will make you think twice before venturing off the beaten path alone. What separates a peaceful hike from a life-threatening encounter is sometimes just a wrong turn, just bad timing, just being in the wrong stretch of forest when someone with dangerous intentions is nearby. Alright, let's begin. And remember, every word of these stories is true. Story 1, The Man in the Snow. I've been a freelance land surveyor for about 15 years now. Most of my work is solo, remote stuff, out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but my equipment and my thoughts. I'm usually camping out for days at a time in places where nobody else is going to be. National forests, private land parcels in mountain ranges, wilderness areas that don't see human traffic except for the occasional hunter or backpacker. I actually prefer it that way. Or at least, I used to prefer it that way. Before what happened 4 years ago fundamentally changed how I approach my work. This particular incident happened in the mountains near the Clearwater region in Idaho. When I say remote, I mean truly, genuinely isolated. It was 6 miles of hiking just to reach the area where I needed to set up my base camp. No roads, no trails maintained by any park service, just rough terrain and dense forest. I filed my route and schedule with the local ranger station like I always do, standard safety protocol for anyone working alone in backcountry. If I didn't check in by a certain date, they'd know to send someone looking. I packed a week's worth of supplies, freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, extra batteries for my GPS and surveying equipment, cold weather gear, emergency shelter, first aid kit, satellite phone. Everything you need to be self-sufficient in a remote location. The job itself was straightforward. I'd been hired to survey boundary markers on a large private land parcel. Basically, I needed to locate and document a series of metal stakes and markers that had been placed years ago to define property lines. The first day went completely smooth. I found 3 of the markers I was looking for, logged their positions with my GPS equipment, took the required photographs, and made it back to my campsite before dark. The forecast had called for cold temperatures and light snow, pretty typical for that region in late November. Nothing I wasn't prepared for or experienced with. That's exactly what I got initially. Cold, a light dusting of snow overnight, but nothing concerning. By the second day, though, things started to change significantly. We got way more snow than the forecast had predicted. Not a blizzard, exactly, but steady, heavy snowfall that was quickly accumulating and making the terrain much more difficult to navigate. The next marker I needed to locate was only about a mile from my camp, or at least, only about a mile in terms of straight line distance. The actual hiking distance was probably closer to 2 miles because of the terrain. Instead of making the smart decision to call off the work right then and there and either hunker down until the weather improved or start making my way back to civilization, I figured, what the hell? It's just one more marker. I can get it done and still have plenty of daylight to get back. That was a mistake. I honestly still think about how stupid it was not to just pack up when I had the chance. The terrain in that area was treacherous even in good conditions. All hidden rocks and steep slopes covered with loose soil and pine needles. Add fresh snow on top of everything, and you're basically walking on ice-covered obstacles you can't see. I was picking my way carefully down a short embankment, testing each step before committing my full weight, when my boot hit a patch of ice I never saw coming. One wrong step like that in the backcountry can literally be the difference between life and death. I'm not exaggerating. I slid probably 15 feet down the slope before I managed to catch myself on an exposed tree root. I was lucky, incredibly lucky, not to have slid further or hit my head on a rock. But the pain in my right ankle was instant and intense. Sharp, shooting pain that made me gasp out loud. I tried to tell myself I was fine, that I just tweaked it and could walk it off. But the moment I tried to stand up and put weight on that leg, I audibly groaned in pain. I couldn't put more than about 20% of my body weight on that ankle without excruciating pain shooting up my leg. I knew immediately what that meant. I had several hours, at minimum, before I'd be able to walk anything close to normally. Possibly longer. I was so angry at myself. So frustrated with my own poor decision-making. But there was nothing I could do about it except deal with the situation I'd created. I abandoned the rest of the survey work right there. No boundary marker was worth getting stranded over, especially not with an injury in deteriorating weather conditions. I painfully made my way back uphill to the main trail I'd been following and started the slow, limping hike back toward my camp. Every step hurt. I had to use a tree branch as a makeshift walking stick to keep weight off my injured ankle. But after a few minutes of slow progress, I noticed something that made me stop and pay closer attention. Boot tracks in the snow on the trail ahead of me. Fresh tracks that hadn't been there when I'd passed this way earlier in the day. The tracks appeared to have come from deeper in the woods off to my left, from an area where there was no trail, no reason for anyone to be walking. They merged onto the main trail and headed in the same direction I was going. Back toward where my camp was located. The tracks looked relatively fresh. I could tell because the edges were still sharp and well-defined despite the fact that it was actively snowing. Old tracks would have been more filled in, more rounded. I figured it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone from the landowner's crew checking on the property boundaries. It's not entirely unusual to cross paths with other people even in remote areas, especially during hunting season. I didn't think much of it initially. I just kept moving, trying to keep as much weight off my injured ankle as possible. As the light started fading, it gets dark early in late November, especially in the mountains, I began hearing sounds behind me on the trail. At first, I chalked it up to normal forest noises. Wind moving through the trees, branches creaking, snow falling from pine boughs. But the more I listened, the more it sounded distinctly like footsteps. The crunch of boots on snow. The rhythm of someone walking. I kept turning around and looking over my shoulder, but I couldn't see anything or anyone behind me. That part of the forest was pretty dense with undergrowth and closely spaced trees, though, so if there was an animal stalking me, or a person following me, there's a good chance I wouldn't have been able to see them from the trail. I stopped walking completely and stood perfectly still, listening intently. The footsteps stopped too. Not immediately, there was a delay of maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but they definitely stopped shortly after I did. I froze and tried to listen for anything unusual or threatening, but there was nothing beyond the ambient sounds of wind and softly falling snow. I started walking again, moving as quickly as my injured ankle would allow. This time, the footsteps didn't resume right away. For several minutes, I walked in silence except for my own movement. I started to relax slightly, thinking maybe I'd just been paranoid or hearing things. But then, a few minutes later, I heard those damn footsteps again. Behind me. Matching my pace. I kept turning around to look, but I still couldn't see anything or anyone. It was especially freaky because I knew that if there was actually a threat out there, animal or human, I wouldn't be able to run. I was barely able to walk at a decent pace. That was honestly the worst part of the whole experience. The complete lack of mobility. The knowledge that I was vulnerable and slow and couldn't defend myself effectively. I would have loved to stop and investigate, or try to scare off whatever animal might be following me, but I didn't have the physical capability to do so safely. So I just kept moving, trying to stay calm, trying not to let fear overwhelm my rational thinking. But then I heard something that didn't fit at all with the forest environment. A metallic sound off to my left, deeper in the trees. I don't really know how to describe it accurately. It was this low, brief sound, like something lightly hitting a metal fence post or a piece of equipment. A sort of dull tick sound. It was deeply unsettling because there wasn't supposed to be anything man-made out there except for the boundary markers, which were miles behind me at that point. So I had no idea what could possibly be making a metallic sound in the middle of unmarked forest. The sound must have distracted me from paying attention to other details, because it suddenly dawned on me that I hadn't been keeping track of those boot prints I'd noticed earlier on the trail. I looked down at the snow in front of me and realized the tracks were gone. Completely absent from the trail. I turned around frantically, scanning the snow behind me, but I couldn't see where the tracks had branched off or turned around. They just disappeared at some point while I'd been focused on the sounds behind me. I kept looking off to my left, trying to see through the dense trees and undergrowth to figure out what had made that metallic sound. My eyes locked onto something, and immediately alarm bells started going off in my brain. There was another set of boot prints coming out of the tree line on my left, running parallel to the trail I was on. Running parallel to my own tracks through the snow. They weren't that far away, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the trail. Close enough to see clearly. Close enough to be deeply concerning. Whoever had been ahead of me on that trail was now walking alongside me through the woods, pacing me, staying just out of sight in the trees. At that point, I was so scared and full of adrenaline that I wasn't thinking straight or rationally. I should have kept my mouth shut. Should have just kept moving without acknowledging that I'd noticed anything wrong. But instead, I spoke up. Called out into the woods, "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" I didn't get an answer. Just silence and softly falling snow. I waited about 20 seconds, standing there on the trail, injured and vulnerable, listening for any response. Nothing. I knew then that I had to get back to my camp as quickly as possible. This wasn't some friendly hunter or landowner employee. Something was very wrong about this situation. But my stupid ankle was still killing me. I couldn't run or even jog. I could barely walk faster than a slow, limping pace. I was relatively close to camp, though, probably only about a quarter mile away. I told myself that if I just kept moving steadily, I'd make it back and be fine. I'd be able to get into my tent, secure my space, maybe use the satellite phone to call for an early extraction if necessary. I wasn't hearing footsteps behind me on the trail anymore, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. Because I knew there was someone out there. Someone who had been ahead of me at one point, then deliberately moved off the trail to walk parallel through the woods. Someone who was following me. Tracking me. For reasons I couldn't understand and didn't want to imagine. I was maybe 100 yards from my campsite when I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy branch snapping somewhere behind me. Not the natural sound of a snow-laden branch breaking under its own weight. This was clearly the sound of something being stepped on or broken deliberately. Loud. Close. Intentional. I didn't stop moving. Didn't turn around. Just kept limping forward as fast as I could, using my makeshift walking stick, gritting my teeth against the pain in my ankle. I kept thinking, if I just make it back to camp, I'll be safe. I'll be okay. Eventually, finally, I reached my campsite. It was fully dark at that point, that complete darkness you only get in wilderness areas with no light pollution. Only after getting inside my tent and zipping it closed did I realize the horrible truth. I wasn't any safer in there than I had been hobbling through the woods. A tent provides no security. No protection. It's just nylon fabric. Anyone could cut through it with a knife in seconds. I started packing immediately, working by headlamp. My injured foot made it so hard to move quickly, to organize my gear efficiently, but I tried my best to rush through the process. Maybe 60% of my fear was due to the fact that in a physical confrontation, a fight, a chase, anything requiring mobility, I would be completely screwed without the ability to move properly. Before I finished packing up all my equipment, I heard the thing I'd been dreading the entire time. Footsteps right outside my tent. Close. Maybe 5 feet away. I was so unbelievably scared at that point that I felt physically sick. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My hands were shaking. I started thinking frantically about all my options, running through scenarios in my head. The footsteps weren't approaching the tent directly. Instead, they were circling it. Walking slowly around the perimeter of my campsite. Around and around. A deliberate circuit. There was nothing I could do but sit there frozen, listening, waiting for whoever was out there to rush the tent or cut through it or announce themselves. The sound of those circling footsteps went on for what felt like 5 minutes, probably more like 2 or 3 minutes in reality, but it felt eternal. And then, abruptly, everything went quiet. I hadn't heard whoever was out there walk away. No retreating footsteps, no sounds of movement through the forest. Just sudden, complete silence. I didn't care. I wasn't staying there another second. Person outside or not, I was leaving. I finished packing my essential gear, sleeping bag, food, water, satellite phone, first aid kit. I left the tent itself and some other equipment behind. They could be replaced. I took a really deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. Then I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the snow and darkness. The moment I got outside, I swept my headlamp across the tree line surrounding my campsite. And I screamed. Actually screamed out loud. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 20 feet away, staring directly at me. He was illuminated by my headlamp, and what I saw made my blood run cold. He was really old, maybe 70s or even 80s. Unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. His face was gaunt and sickly looking, covered with what looked like open sores or lesions. He looked like he was dying. Like he should be in a hospital, not standing in the middle of a frozen forest in the dark. He looked absolutely disgusting. Wrong. Like something that shouldn't exist. I stared back at him, frozen in terror, fully expecting him to charge at me or pull out a weapon. But he didn't move. Just stood there staring with sunken eyes. I put my hands up in a placating gesture and said, my voice shaking, I don't want any trouble. I'm just leaving. That's all. I'm leaving right now. He didn't respond. Didn't move. Just kept staring. I didn't know what to do. The staring contest lasted for what felt like several minutes, probably more like 30 or 40 seconds, neither of us moving or speaking. Then he said something that I still think about regularly, that still gives me chills when I remember it. He said, in a raspy, quiet voice, "You're a lucky man." Just those 4 words. Then he turned and disappeared into the woods. Just melted back into the darkness between the trees. The rest of that night is pretty blurry in my memory, partly because I was still in tremendous physical pain from my ankle and partly because of the psychological trauma of the encounter. I packed up the rest of my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking out, not even caring that it was pitch dark and dangerous to navigate. The 6-mile hike back to my vehicle took me almost 8 hours with my injured ankle. It should have taken maybe 3 hours maximum in daylight. I had to stop frequently to rest, to manage the pain, to make sure I wasn't getting off course. When I eventually made it back to civilization and got my ankle checked out at an urgent care clinic, I was told I had severely sprained it, possibly even a small fracture that hadn't shown up clearly on the X-ray. The doctor was amazed that I hadn't done permanent damage by walking 6 miles on it through rough terrain in the dark. I ended up reporting the encounter with the man in the woods to the county sheriff's office, but I knew nothing was going to come of it. What would they even do? Send deputies out to search 6 miles into federal forest land for a sick old man who may or may not still be out there? They took my statement, filed it away, and that was that. I didn't take another winter contract for almost a year after that incident. Partly because of my ankle injury, but mostly because I was too psychologically shaken to feel comfortable working alone in remote locations. I still do remote survey work today, it's my livelihood, and I'm good at it, and it pays well. But I don't camp alone on winter assignments anymore. I either bring someone with me, usually a hired assistant or a colleague also working in the area, or I turn the job down entirely. And I'm much more cautious about where I agree to work. I do more research on the area, check recent reports of unusual activity, make sure there's easier access to civilization if something goes wrong. This is still the scariest thing that has ever happened to me in 15 years of working in remote wilderness areas. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, had equipment failures, dealt with severe weather. But nothing compares to that feeling of being stalked by another human being while injured and unable to defend yourself properly. If that man in the woods had wanted to hurt me or kill me, he probably could have. Easily. With my ankle messed up, there would have been nothing I could have done to stop him. I think about what he said sometimes, "You're a lucky man." Was he commenting on the fact that I'd survived the encounter? That he'd chosen not to hurt me for some reason? Or was it something else? Some warning I didn't understand? I'll never know. And honestly, I'm okay with never knowing. Story 2, the cabin that wasn't there. I've lived in Alaska most of my life. My family moved to Fairbanks when I was 6 years old, and I never really left after that. I spent my summers as a teenager working at fish camps, those seasonal operations where they process salmon catches. Started guiding professionally in my early 20s, and that's basically been my life ever since. I'm 29 now. I work seasonally as a wilderness guide in northern Alaska, and I've been doing it long enough that I don't really get rattled much out there anymore. I don't get lost. Or I guess I should say I didn't think I could get lost, because what happened 3 years ago forced me to seriously reconsider that assumption. My boyfriend at the time was Randy. He grew up in rural British Columbia and was basically the male version of me when it came to outdoor experience and skills. Actually, that's not really fair to him. He was probably more experienced than me in certain specific areas, like winter navigation and cold weather survival. We'd been together about 4 years at that point, and honestly, most of our relationship revolved around trips and adventures that would make normal couples absolutely miserable. Week-long hunting expeditions. Multi-day backcountry camping trips where you genuinely have to plan carefully and know what you're doing or you'll die. That sounds dramatic, but it's literally true up here in Alaska. The wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. The plan for this particular trip was relatively straightforward. We were going to snowmobile between 2 state-registered cabins that were about 60 miles apart. These are public-use cabins maintained by Alaska State Parks, small structures scattered throughout wilderness areas that anyone can reserve and use for a small fee. We'd spend one night at the first cabin, ride to the second cabin the next day, spend a night there, then ride back home. 4 days total, round trip. We'd done this exact same trip twice before without any issues. It was familiar territory, a known route, well within our skill level. The weather forecast looked good when we left Fairbanks, cold but clear, light winds, no precipitation expected. We weren't worried at all. This was going to be a fun, easy trip. The first day was completely uneventful in the best possible way. We made good time on the snowmobiles, the machines ran perfectly, and we reached the first cabin by late afternoon. We ate these freeze-dried meals that Randy swore tasted good but were honestly pretty terrible, like eating cardboard that vaguely resembled chicken and rice. Then we played cards for a few hours, drank some whiskey Randy had brought, and just relaxed. It was actually a really nice, peaceful evening. The next morning when I woke up, I immediately knew something was wrong. I could hear wind absolutely howling outside the cabin, and when I looked out the small window, I could barely see anything through the blowing snow. There was a genuine storm happening outside. Not just light snow or flurries, this was a full-on blizzard that had come out of absolutely nowhere. Which was shocking and frustrating because there had been nothing in the weather forecast indicating any precipitation, let alone a major storm system. Randy and I discussed our options over instant coffee and energy bars. We had plenty of food. We could easily wait out the storm for another day, maybe 2 days if necessary, until conditions improved enough to travel safely. That would have been the smart decision. The safe decision. But we decided to try to push through and make it to the second cabin despite the conditions. We had the coordinates programmed into our GPS units, we had experience riding in poor visibility, and it was only about 30 miles. We should have waited. I know that now. We both knew it even then, deep down. Things went wrong almost immediately after we left the relative safety of the cabin. The wind was worse than it had seemed from inside. Way worse. Almost worse than the snow itself. It was hard to see more than 20 or 30 feet ahead at times. The blowing snow created this complete whiteout effect where you couldn't distinguish between ground and sky. Randy took the lead since he had more experience with winter navigation. I was content to just follow the tracks his snowmobile made, which was significantly easier than trying to navigate independently in those conditions. I don't really know exactly how it happened, everything occurred so fast, but 1 second Randy was moving steadily ahead of me, and the next second his snowmobile was on its side with him pinned underneath it. I jumped off my machine and ran over to him as fast as I could move in the deep snow. But I was too late to prevent the injury. His leg was bent at an angle that legs absolutely should not bend. Clearly broken, badly broken, probably in multiple places. Keep in mind, this was a guy who had once finished a 2-day backcountry trek on a sprained ankle and didn't even mention the injury until we were back at his truck. Randy had an insanely high pain tolerance. So the fact that he was clearly in agony told me how serious this was. The first thing I tried, the obvious solution, was getting him onto my snowmobile so I could drive us both back to the cabin we'd left that morning. But Randy is 6'2" and probably weighed 220 pounds at the time. And snowmobiles aren't like ATVs where you can just throw someone on the back and drive away. An Arctic cat in deep snow is already a lot of machine to handle solo. I got him up once, basically half dragged, half lifted him onto the seat behind me, and he lasted maybe 10 seconds before he started sliding off the side. The sound he made when he hit the ground is something I never want to hear again. A combination of impact and pure pain. I tried one more time, and it was even worse. He couldn't grip with his injured leg at all, couldn't balance, and every time the machine shifted even slightly he'd start to slide. There was nothing I could do to hold him steady and steer the snowmobile at the same time. After the second attempt, Randy told me to stop. And the way he said it, he wasn't asking me, he was telling me. That's when we both kind of silently accepted what the actual plan was going to have to be. I pulled out our satellite phone with hands that were shaking so badly I almost dropped it in the snow. I actually managed to get a connection after a few tries, which was somewhat miraculous given the weather conditions and our location. But the connection kept cutting in and out. I wasn't sure if my message about our coordinates and situation actually got through to anyone. I left Randy sheltered with every extra layer we had, wrapped in sleeping bags and emergency blankets, with our remaining food and water and the satellite phone. Then I marked our exact coordinates on my GPS unit. Randy looked at me and said, "Be careful. Don't do anything stupid." And then I just left him there in the snow, knowing that if I didn't make it to help, if I got lost or injured or my snowmobile broke down, he would die out there. That thought was almost paralyzing. But staying together wasn't an option, we'd both freeze waiting for rescue that might not come. I had to try. I started riding toward where I thought the nearest cabin should be, navigating mostly by GPS and feel since visibility was still terrible. After about 4 to 5 minutes of riding through the blizzard, things started feeling off. Landmarks weren't matching up with what I expected. The terrain didn't look right, or at least what little I could see of it through the snow. I kept telling myself it was just the weather conditions messing with my perception, making familiar territory look strange. But the feeling of wrongness just kept getting worse and worse. And then I saw smoke through the trees off to my left. Thin gray smoke rising into the white sky, barely visible through the falling snow. I immediately angled my snowmobile toward it, thinking I'd somehow gotten turned around and looped back to one of the registered cabins. But as I got closer, the structure didn't match either of the cabins I knew about. It was smaller and kind of run-down looking, honestly. One side was almost completely buried in a massive snow drift, and the whole thing had this abandoned, neglected appearance. But there was definitely smoke coming from the chimney, and I could see a faint glow through one of the small windows. At that point, my thinking was simple: smoke meant a person, and a person meant either a radio I could use to call for help or at least someone who could assist with Randy's rescue. I killed the snowmobile engine and trudged through the deep snow over to the cabin's front door. I knocked several times, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here? I need help." No response. No sound of movement from inside. I tried the door handle, not really expecting it to be unlocked, but it turned easily and the door swung open. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by a wave of warmth. It was genuinely, surprisingly warm in there compared to the freezing conditions outside. The cabin was clearly inhabited, or at least had been very recently. There was a wood stove in the corner with a fire actively burning. A bedroll on the floor with blankets that looked slept in. A can of some kind of food, looked like beans or stew, sitting on the floor with a spoon still in it, like someone had been eating moments before I arrived. It honestly looked like whoever lived here had walked out the door maybe 5 minutes before I came in. I called out again, "Hello? Anyone here? I need help, there's been an accident." No answer. Just the sound of wind outside and the crackling of the fire in the stove. I stood there warming my hands by the stove, trying the satellite phone again to see if I could get a signal from inside the cabin. No luck. Still no connection. I didn't want to go back out into that brutal weather yet, but I knew I had to. Randy's life was literally depending on me getting help as quickly as possible. As I was turning to leave, I noticed something sitting on a shelf mounted on the back wall. I walked over to get a closer look and saw a pair of binoculars, along with a folded map and a small spiral notebook. I unfolded the map and realized it was a detailed trail map of the exact area Randy and I had been traveling through. Sections of it were circled in marker, at least a dozen different circles scattered across the map. I recognized some of the circled locations. 2 of them specifically jumped out at me. Both of the registered state cabins Randy and I had been using were circled. And there were dates written next to each circle in pencil. Some of the dates were from this current winter. Some were from the winter before. Some went back 3 or 4 years. I picked up the spiral notebook with a growing sense of unease. As I flipped through the pages, I realized whoever owned this notebook had been meticulously documenting people. Detailed descriptions of individuals, what they were wearing, what kind of equipment they were carrying, what direction they were headed, approximate age and build. Dates and times. License plate numbers in some cases, probably from vehicles parked at trailheads. I was instantly, deeply unsettled. There was a very good chance that Randy and I were somewhere in that notebook. That would been observed and documented without our knowledge on one of our previous trips through this area. The whole cabin suddenly felt different. Threatening instead of safe. Wrong instead of welcoming. I didn't stick around to search for entries about us. I put everything back down on the shelf and headed straight for the door. But before I could reach the door handle, before I could get out of that cabin, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. A scream. The loudest, most terrifying scream I have ever heard in my entire life. It came from below me. From under the floor. From beneath the cabin. It was a woman's voice, and she wasn't saying anything, wasn't calling for help or forming words. Just screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. Screaming like she was being tortured, like she was in unimaginable pain or terror. The shock of it made me literally jump backward. And then I just ran. Didn't think, didn't investigate, just ran for the door as fast as I could move. I got on my snowmobile and started the engine with shaking hands, then rode away from that cabin as fast as the machine would go in those conditions. I never looked back. Never got another glimpse of the structure through the blowing snow. I was a complete mess after that, shaking, crying, barely able to think clearly. I don't really remember the rest of the journey with any clarity. At some point, operating mostly on autopilot and GPS navigation, I made it to the actual registered cabin I'd been trying to reach. I got through on the emergency radio mounted on the cabin wall and explained the situation. My boyfriend was severely injured and stranded, I had GPS coordinates, we needed immediate helicopter evacuation. They had to dispatch a helicopter specially equipped for mountain rescue to reach Randy in those weather conditions. By the time they got to him and brought him to a hospital in Fairbanks, he was in terrible shape, hypothermic, his leg injury was severe, and he'd been lying in the snow for hours. But he was alive. Conscious. He survived. It was the worst few hours of my life, the waiting, the not knowing if he was going to make it, the guilt of having left him there. I have trouble even piecing together the sequence of events in my memory because I was so traumatized. Randy did survive, obviously, but the experience was so horrific for him that he swore off winter backcountry travel completely after that. At least, he swore it off for as long as we were still together. I don't know what he does now. I told as many people as I could about that cabin. Told the rescue helicopter crew, told the state troopers, told the Park Service. I described the location as precisely as I could based on my GPS records. I told them about the map, the notebook, the scream from under the floor. I was told they'd send someone out to investigate as soon as weather conditions were safe enough to do so. And you better believe I followed up on that repeatedly over the following weeks. After several days, I finally got a call back from a state trooper investigator. He told me they'd sent a small team out to the coordinates I'd provided, but they weren't able to find any structure matching my description. No cabin. No chimney. No smoke. Nothing but trees and snow. The guy I was speaking with, I'll never forget this, he actually had the audacity to suggest that I might have hallucinated the whole experience. That the stress of Randy's injury, the cold, the fear, the physical exhaustion had caused me to imagine a detailed 10-minute experience inside a building that didn't actually exist. I absolutely flipped out on him. Started yelling about how I knew what I saw, how I was certain about what happened, how dare he suggest I'd made it up. That was basically the end of the conversation. He wished me well and hung up. Randy and I broke up about a year after the incident. It had nothing to do with what happened in the woods, our relationship just ran its course naturally. But I still think about that cabin all the time. I dream about it sometimes. There are really only 3 ways to explain what happened that day, and none of them are good options. The first explanation is that none of it was real. That I really did hallucinate everything. The cabin, the warmth, the map, the notebook, the scream. I was terrified and half frozen and I just left my boyfriend potentially dying in the snow, and my brain constructed an elaborate, detailed experience inside a building that didn't exist. I can't fully rule that out, as much as I hate to admit it. The human mind can do strange things under extreme stress. The second explanation is that it was real, and the person screaming under those floorboards was someone who desperately needed help. Someone I just left there, probably to die. Maybe the state troopers couldn't find the place because they didn't search hard enough, or because the coordinates I gave them were slightly off. And whoever was trapped under that cabin, I don't even want to think about what might have happened to them. The third explanation, the one that terrifies me most, is that it was some kind of trap. Maybe the smoke and the light and the unlocked door were all specifically designed to draw someone in. And whoever had been documenting people in that notebook had been tracking travelers through that area for years, learning patterns, watching and waiting. Looking for opportunities to kidnap someone, or worse. And I had walked directly into it. If the scream hadn't happened when it did, if I'd stayed in that cabin just a few more minutes, it might have been me under those floorboards. Or worse, maybe the scream I heard was from someone who'd been unlucky enough to walk into that cabin before me. Someone who fell into the trap I almost fell into. I'm not sure what to make of any of this, even 3 years later. All I know is that somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, there may or may not be a cabin that appears and disappears. And if it's real, someone needs to find it before someone else walks through that door. Story 3, the girl who led me into the woods. When I was a junior in high school, there was this girl I spent an embarrassing amount of time thinking about. Her name was Sienna Rollins, and she had this presence about her that's genuinely difficult to explain, but I'll try my best. She was really pretty, obviously, objectively attractive in that way that everyone notices even if they don't admit it. But it was more than just physical appearance. She had this mystique, this quality that I could never quite figure out or understand. A mystique that you wouldn't typically associate with a generic pretty high school girl. She wasn't popular at all. In fact, I got the strong impression that most people, guys and girls alike, were more intimidated by her than attracted to her. She wasn't warm or friendly. She didn't smile much. She kept to herself almost obsessively. Most people at our school regarded her as weird, off-putting, maybe even a little creepy. I didn't see her that way. I actually found her uniqueness kind of fascinating in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Catching eyes with her in the hallway would literally freeze me up, like the way your body adjusts when you walk into a cold room or get hit with an unexpected gust of wind. She reminded me of snow, honestly. The way a light snowfall can muffle everything around you, sounds, movement, even your own thoughts. She had that same quality, that same effect on the space around her. But it seemed like nobody else noticed or appreciated it the way I did. People just thought the way she kept to herself and rarely spoke was strange or antisocial. But I was always dying to know what she was thinking, what was going on inside her head behind those cold, calculating eyes. I read a lot of young adult fantasy novels during my junior year, probably too many, honestly. Epic quests, mysterious heroines, that whole genre. I also wrote a lot during that time. Short stories, mostly. Fragments of ideas that never went anywhere. I actually named one of the main characters in a story I was writing Sienna, after her. You could say I was obsessed, though I'd prefer to say I was just really inspired by the name. Anyway, one day I was walking up the stairs between classes with my friend George, and we were talking about that exact story I'd been working on. George asked me what the characters' names were, and I started listing them off. And of course, because the universe has a cruel sense of timing, just as I mentioned the name Sienna, who should turn the corner at the top of the stairs but the actual Sienna Rollins herself. She was walking with one of her few friends, I think the girl's name was Maya or Mia, and she definitely heard me say her name. She flashed me this little smirk. The closest thing to a genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. And she said something like, "Yeah, because you love me, or because you're obsessed with me, or something along those lines." I was absolutely mortified. My face went bright red. George started laughing, which made everything so much worse. Sienna was already moving past me, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation or dwelling on the moment. She was heading down the stairs, and my window of opportunity was rapidly closing. I don't know what came over me, probably some combination of embarrassment and adrenaline and the teenage conviction that bold action is always better than regret. But right there on the spot, I called after her, "Do you want to go out sometime?" That actually got her to stop. She turned around on the stairs and gave me one of her famous icy stares. She didn't even have to speak. Her eyes communicated everything. "How dare you even ask me that? You've got some nerve." I was already preparing myself for brutal public rejection. But then she completely surprised me. She actually agreed. She pulled out her phone and told me to put my number in. Then she said she'd text me to set something up, and she walked away without waiting for me to respond or say anything else. I just stood there on the stairs, absolutely shocked. George was staring at me like I'd just performed magic. And that's how I ended up going on what I thought was a date with the girl I'd been obsessing over for months. The outing wasn't my idea, by the way. None of it was my plan or suggestion. Sienna organized everything, chose the activity, picked the location, set the time, told me where to meet her. I got the very clear impression that I had no choice but to go along with whatever she wanted, and honestly, I was completely fine with that arrangement. So fast forward to that weekend. Saturday morning. Sienna texted me an address and told me to be ready by 10 a.m. She was driving us out to some hiking trail she'd picked. I'd never been there before, and neither had anyone I knew. The drive was about 4 to 5 minutes from town, heading out into a rural area I wasn't familiar with at all. But it felt like it only lasted 10 minutes because I was so completely in my own head the entire time, barely able to believe this was actually happening. Sienna had her window down despite the cool morning air, and she was playing music from her phone, artists I didn't recognize, which tracked perfectly with her whole mysterious vibe. We didn't talk much during the drive. She seemed content with the silence, and I was too nervous to initiate conversation. We pulled into this gravel parking lot at the base of the trail. There were maybe 2 other cars parked there, decent amount of space, not crowded, which I appreciated. Sienna didn't hesitate or discuss the plan. She just got out of the car and started walking toward the trailhead. I followed, naturally. For the first 20 minutes or so, things were actually really nice. Better than I'd expected, honestly. Sienna was more talkative than I'd ever seen her at school, which admittedly still wasn't that talkative, but for her it was practically chatty. She asked me about the story I'd been writing, which was simultaneously flattering and embarrassing. I gave her a rough summary while trying desperately not to sound like a complete idiot or reveal how much of the main character was based on her. She seemed genuinely interested, or at least she was good at pretending to be interested. The trail narrowed after a while as we got deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, blocking out more sunlight. We hadn't seen another person since leaving the parking lot, which created this isolated, intimate atmosphere that was both exciting and slightly unnerving. At some point, maybe 4 to 5 minutes into the hike, the trail split into a clear fork. Two paths diverging in completely different directions. I stopped and asked Sienna which way we should go. She pointed left without any hesitation. Didn't consult a map or her phone or a trail marker. Just immediately chose left. I asked her if she'd been to this trail before, wanting to know if she was familiar with the area. She said no, she'd never been here. I found that answer kind of strange, especially given how definitive and confident she'd seemed about choosing left. But I didn't question her decision or press for more explanation. I just followed. The left fork was noticeably less maintained than the main trail had been. More overgrown, less clearly defined, fewer signs of regular use. I started to get the feeling we might be going the wrong way, but I wasn't going to question Sienna's judgment or contradict her. I must have been really lost in my own thoughts about that, because at one point I suddenly realized I couldn't hear Sienna's footsteps behind me anymore. The trail had gotten narrow enough that would naturally fallen into single-file hiking, and she gestured for me to take the lead a few minutes earlier. But when I turned around to check on her or ask her a question, she wasn't there. The trail behind me was completely empty. No Sienna anywhere in sight. I called out her name, "Sienna? Where'd you go?" No response. Just forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, nothing human. I was confused and starting to get worried. I started walking back the way we'd come, retracing our steps. I made it all the way back to the fork where the trail had split, and she wasn't there either. I looked around, genuinely puzzled now, trying to figure out where she could have possibly gone. There was no side trail for her to have wandered off onto. No obvious place she could have stepped aside to use the bathroom privately. She was just gone. Vanished. So I decided to try the right fork, the path we hadn't taken, thinking maybe she'd somehow gotten confused and gone that way by mistake. To my surprise, that side was even more overgrown and neglected looking than the left fork had been. The further I walked down the right path, the less it felt like an actual maintained trail. More like just a gap between trees that vaguely resembled a path. I kept calling Sienna's name like an idiot, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't imagine why she would have deliberately abandoned me, so I genuinely thought this was just some kind of honest mistake or miscommunication. At one point, maybe 10 minutes down the right fork, I heard a branch snap somewhere off to my left, deeper in the trees off the trail. I stopped walking and looked in that direction, and I saw movement. Something shifted position behind one of the thicker tree trunks. And immediately, I thought I knew exactly what was going on. It was Sienna messing with me. Playing some kind of game, trying to spook me or surprise me. That would have been completely on brand for her personality, the kind of slightly cruel, testing behavior she seemed to find amusing. So I figured I'd turn the tables on her. Surprise her before she could surprise me. I slowly and quietly approached the tree where I'd seen the movement, trying to be stealthy. At the last second, I jumped around to the side of the tree with this triumphant yell, ready to scare Sienna. But as I was mid-yell, in that split second of revelation, I realized it wasn't Sienna at all. It was a man. A tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and weathered features. I was horrified, completely mortified by my mistake. But it was too late, I was already inches away from this stranger. I instinctively took several steps backward, stammering an apology. The man just stared at me with this completely flat, emotionless expression. He didn't seem startled or scared at all by my sudden appearance. Before he could say anything, I blurted out something about how I was just looking for my friend, that I thought he was someone else. Which in hindsight was a completely useless thing to say. He clearly didn't care about my explanation. He started walking toward me. Not aggressively, exactly, but purposefully. Moving in my direction without saying anything. I turned and started walking back toward the trail, trying to move casually, trying not to obviously run or show fear. But then I heard a second sound off to my right. Another person moving through the woods. I looked over and saw another man, younger than the first guy, but with the same kind of rough, outdoorsy appearance, standing openly in a small clearing about 30 feet away. He wasn't even trying to hide or be subtle. Just standing there watching me. And he was holding what looked like a thick tree branch in his hand. Holding it like a weapon, like a club. That's when pure panic kicked in and I just ran. The second guy was positioned between me and the trail I'd come from, blocking the obvious escape route. So I just started running through the woods with no real sense of direction, hoping desperately that I'd find another way back to the main trail. As soon as I started running, both men started running after me. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind me. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. Just running at full speed, chasing me. I ran for several seconds, jumping over fallen logs and dodging between trees, my heart absolutely pounding with terror and adrenaline. Before I could react or change direction, something grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, hitting the ground face first, getting a mouthful of dirt and pine needles. It was the first guy, the middle-aged man I'd initially startled. He'd somehow gotten ahead of me and was now trying to pin me down. He grabbed my legs, trying to hold me in place. I screamed and kicked as hard as I possibly could, thrashing wildly, driven by pure survival instinct. By some miracle, pure luck or adrenaline-fueled strength, I was able to kick him hard enough to get him off me. I scrambled back to my feet and kept running, not daring to look back. My mouth was full of blood at that point. I must have bitten my lip or tongue when I fell, because I could taste copper and feel something wet on my chin. I don't think they followed me after that initial tackle. Or if they did, they gave up relatively quickly. But I didn't care. I just kept running until I found what looked like the main trail, then kept running along it until I finally burst out into the parking lot. I was gasping for air, shaking, probably looking absolutely insane to anyone who might have seen me. Sienna's car was still in the lot, parked exactly where it had been. But the other two cars that had been there when we arrived were gone. Sienna herself was nowhere in sight, which absolutely freaked me out. I started thinking that those men who had chased me had somehow gotten to her. That she was in danger or hurt or worse. I didn't know what to do. I was panicking, my thoughts racing in circles. I must have called her phone like 10 times in rapid succession. Every call went straight to voicemail. I was just about to call 911 when my phone buzzed with a text from Sienna. "Where did you go?" Just those 4 words. Casual. Like nothing was wrong. I was typing a frantic response when I looked up and saw her walking calmly out of the tree line at the edge of the parking lot. She looked completely normal. Not scared, not hurt, not disheveled. Just, fine. I yelled at her to hurry up and get to the car, trying to explain that there were dangerous people in the woods, that we needed to leave immediately. But she didn't seem particularly moved or concerned by what I was saying. She walked to her car at a normal pace, unlocked it, got in. I climbed into the passenger seat, still breathing hard, still shaking. I told her everything that had happened, how she'd disappeared, how I'd been chased by 2 men, how one of them had grabbed me. She still didn't react with anything approaching appropriate concern. If anything, she seemed more annoyed or irritated than anything else. That's when I demanded to know where she had gone. How she had just disappeared from the trail. She told me she thought I had gone ahead without her and that she'd been trying to catch up to me the whole time. I knew immediately that was a lie. There was no way that explanation made sense. I had walked all the way back to the fork in the trail, and I would have absolutely seen her if she'd been anywhere on the path behind me. That's when it started to dawn on me, this horrible suspicion that was almost too disturbing to fully consider. What if Sienna had something to do with what happened? What if she deliberately led me there? I thought about the sequence of events, the trail she'd picked that neither of us had supposedly been to before, the left fork she'd chosen so definitively, the way she'd positioned me to go first before disappearing. And then, within minutes of her vanishing, 2 strange men appeared in the exact stretch of woods she'd led me into. It felt orchestrated. Planned. Too coincidental to be random chance. And then she just showed up afterward, completely unharmed, acting like nothing unusual had happened, asking me where I'd gone. The ride back to town was the tensest, most uncomfortable 4 to 5 minutes of my life. I kept looking over at her, studying her face, trying to read any sign of guilt or concern or emotion. But she just drove calmly, listening to her music, acting like we'd just had a normal, slightly boring hike. I couldn't get over the facts. Sienna disappeared without explanation. 2 dangerous men appeared almost immediately afterward. She reappeared after the whole incident without a scratch on her. It felt deliberate. It felt like a setup. We got to my house, I got out of the car, we said awkward goodbyes, and then she drove away. And I was just left standing in my driveway, still in shock, trying to process what had happened. We didn't hang out a single time after that. Not once. I never asked her to, obviously. And if I wasn't reaching out to Sienna, there was absolutely 0 chance she was going to reach out to me. She went back to being the cold, distant, mysterious girl at school who barely acknowledged my existence. I've told this story to maybe 4 or 5 close friends over the years since graduating high school. The response is always essentially the same: Sienna set you up. She knew that trail. She knew those people in the woods. The whole thing was planned. I've considered that explanation more times than I can count. I've thought about it obsessively, trying to find another way to interpret what happened. But I genuinely have no idea why anyone would do something like that. What would be the motivation? Was it some kind of sick game? A test? A near miss for something even worse? I have no idea where Sienna is now. She's not on any social media that I can find. I have no idea where she went to college or what she's doing with her life. Sometimes I wonder if she did the same thing to other people. If I was just one in a series of guys she led into those woods. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been able to kick that man off me when he grabbed my ankle. Would I have become another person who just disappeared on a hiking trail? Another unsolved missing person case? I'll never know. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. 3 people. 3 forests. 3 encounters that defied easy explanation. A stalker who vanished into the snow, a cabin that may not have existed, a girl who may have led someone into a trap. I want to thank everyone who shared their experiences. The woods can be beautiful, peaceful, restorative. But they can also hide danger that doesn't become apparent until you're miles from help, alone, vulnerable. If you found these stories compelling, please like and subscribe. And if you've had your own disturbing experience in the woods, something that made you question what you saw, something that still haunts you years later, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be told and believed. Stay safe out there, everyone. Tell someone where you're going. Carry a satellite phone. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't what you can see. It's what you don't see until it's too late. Until next time.